She scrubbed floors to survive. He lived alone to forget. But when Jake Mitchell spotted those dark bruises on Elena's wrists that morning in 1887, he had no idea he was about to uncover a web of violence that stretched across the Arizona territory. What this quiet rancher did next would shake Copper Ridge to its core, because by sunrise, the man who'd been terrorizing Elena for months had completely vanished without a trace. Some say Jake buried him in the desert. Others whisper he fed him to the coyotes. But the truth is far more shocking than anyone in town could have imagined. This is the story of how one man's decision to protect his housekeeper would expose a criminal empire, rescue an innocent child, and prove that sometimes justice comes not from a badge, but from the barrel of a gun. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Wild West, and about how far a good man will go when evil comes knocking at his door. The Arizona sun had barely crested the mesa when Jake Mitchell noticed something that would change everything. It was October of 1887, and the morning air still carried the desert's chill as he stepped onto the porch of his ranch house, coffee mug in hand. He'd always been an early riser, a habit carved into him by years of solitary living and the demands of cattle that didn't care about a man's need for sleep. Jake Mitchell wasn't much for conversation. At 34, he'd learned that words were often wasted on wind, and silence was a man's most reliable companion. His ranch sat like a lonely island in the vast expanse of Copper Ridge, Arizona territory, miles from the nearest neighbor and a day's hard ride from town. The land was harsh, unforgiving, but it was his. Every fence post, every water well, every head of cattle bore the mark of his labor. He'd hired Elena Vargas 3 months prior, after his previous housekeeper had up and married the blacksmith's son. Elena had appeared at his door one scorching afternoon, hat in hand, asking for work in broken English mixed with rapid Spanish. She was small, maybe 25, with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets Jake didn't pry into. He needed help managing the house, she needed work, and that was arrangement enough for two people who understood that some stories were better left untold. Elena was punctual, thorough, and quiet, qualities Jake appreciated. She arrived each morning before dawn, prepared his meals, cleaned his house, and disappeared into the small cabin he'd built for her behind the main house. She never asked for anything beyond her wages, never complained about the isolation, never tried to fill the silence with unnecessary chatter. In the 3 months she'd worked for him, Jake had learned exactly 3 things about her. She could cook better than any woman in Copper Ridge. She flinched whenever thunder rolled across the desert, and she always wore long sleeves, even in the brutal Arizona heat. That morning, as Jake sipped his coffee and watched the sun paint the distant mountains gold, Elena emerged from the kitchen carrying a basin of wash water. She wore her usual long-sleeve dress, dark blue with small white flowers, buttoned tight at the wrists and neck despite the climbing temperature. But as she lifted the heavy basin to dump it off the side of the porch, her sleeve caught on the wooden rail. The fabric pulled back just an inch, maybe 2, but it was enough. Jake's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. There, wrapped around Elena's left wrist like a dark bracelet, was a bruise. Not the pale yellow of an old injury, but the deep purple-black of something fresh, something angry. The shape was unmistakable, finger marks, clear as day, as if someone had gripped her wrist hard enough to leave their signature in her flesh. Elena noticed his stare and quickly tugged her sleeve back down, but the damage was done. Jake had seen it, and more importantly, she knew he'd seen it. Her dark eyes met his for just a moment, a flash of fear, shame, defiance all tangled together, before she turned away and hurried back toward the kitchen. Jake set his mug down on the porch rail with deliberate slowness. His mind was already working, connecting dots he'd been too polite or too distracted to notice before. The way Elena sometimes winced when she thought no one was looking. how she'd arrive some mornings moving slower than usual, more careful with her tasks. The fact that she never spoke of family, never mentioned friends, never asked for time to visit town. He'd assumed she was simply a woman who preferred solitude, like himself. Now he wondered if solitude was something she'd chosen, or something that had been forced upon her. Jake Mitchell had always believed in minding his own business. The desert taught a man that interference often led to trouble, and trouble was something he'd spent years trying to avoid. He'd come to Arizona territory to escape complications, to build a life where the only problems he faced were drought, rustlers, and the occasional ornery bull. But as he stood on that porch, watching Elena disappear into the shadows of his kitchen, Jake felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't curiosity. Curiosity was passive, safe. This was something more dangerous. This was the kind of feeling that made a man ask questions he might not want answered, that made him step into situations he might not be able to step out of. The sun climbed higher, and the desert began its daily transformation from cool refuge to blazing furnace. But Jake remained on the porch, staring at the spot where Elena's sleeve had slipped, seeing those finger-shaped bruises burned into his memory like a brand. He didn't know it yet, but that single glimpse of violence had just set in motion a chain of events that would turn his quiet ranch into a battleground, transform his solitary existence into something far more complicated, and force him to become the kind of man he'd never thought he'd need to be, the kind of man who made people disappear. Jake Mitchell wasn't a man who rushed into conversations, but the image of those bruises had been eating at him all morning like acid on metal. By noon, the Arizona sun was beating down mercilessly, and Elena was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, her movements careful and deliberate. Every few seconds, she'd glance toward the horizon as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. Jake approached slowly, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. Elena tensed when she heard him coming, her hands stilling on the wet sheet she'd been pinning to the line. She didn't turn around. "Elena," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd made a decision. "We need to talk." "Senor Mitchell, if my work is not, your work is fine." Jake stepped closer, close enough that she had to face him. "It's not about your work." Elena's dark eyes darted to his face, then away, settling on some distant point beyond his shoulder. Her hands twisted in the damp fabric of the sheet, knuckles white with tension. "This morning," Jake continued, his voice steady but gentle, "when you were carrying the wash water, I saw your wrist." The color drained from Elena's face like water from a broken barrel. She released the sheet and instinctively tugged at her sleeves, even though they were already pulled down tight. "I don't know what you mean, senor." Jake shook his head. "Don't lie to me, Elena. I've seen bruises before. I know what finger marks look like." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling through the laundry and the distant lowing of cattle. Elena stood frozen, caught between flight and surrender, her breathing shallow and quick. "Who did that to you?" Jake asked, his voice taking on an edge that would have warned off a rattlesnake. "Nobody," Elena whispered. I fell." "Elena," Jake's voice was soft but implacable. "I wasn't born yesterday. Someone put their hands on you, and I want to know who." Elena's composure cracked like ice under summer sun. Her shoulders began to shake, and she pressed one hand to her mouth, as if trying to hold back words that wanted to escape. "You don't understand," she said finally, her accent thicker with emotion. "If I tell you, if I say his name, he will come here. He will hurt you, and then he will take me back, and everything will be worse." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Take you back? Back where?" Elena closed her eyes tight. "To town, to the silver dollar, to the room upstairs where he keeps me when he... She couldn't finish, but Jake didn't need her to. The Silver Dollar Saloon was known throughout Copper Ridge as a place where men went for drinking, gambling, and worse. Jake had never been upstairs, but he'd heard the stories whispered in barbershops and around campfires. "What's his name?" Jake asked, his voice deadly quiet. Elena shook her head violently. "No, senor, please. You are a good man, but you don't know him. Diego Castellanos, they call him El Lobo. He owns half the men in this territory. Sheriff Hayes, Judge Morrison, even Father Miguel looks the other way when Diego comes to town." Jake had heard the name whispered in fearful tones. Diego El Lobo Castellanos was rumored to run everything from cattle rustling to protection rackets across 3 counties. Men said he had the cunning of a wolf and twice the cruelty. But Jake had always figured the stories were exaggerated, the kind of legends that grew in the telling around saloon tables. "How long?" Jake asked. 2 years, Elena whispered, "since my husband died. Diego said I owed him money, said Jose had borrowed from him. When I couldn't pay—" She gestured helplessly at herself. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "And you came here to hide from him?" "I tried to run before. He always finds me, always brings me back. But this time I thought, maybe if I stayed far enough from town, maybe if I was quiet enough." "How did you get away this time?" Elena's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't get away, senor. He knows where I am. He's been letting me stay here because it amuses him. Like a cat playing with a mouse before—" She couldn't finish. Jake felt rage building in his chest like a thunderstorm gathering on the horizon. "When did you last see him?" 3 days ago. He came to my cabin while you were in the south pasture, he said. He said he was getting tired of this game, that soon he would come for me, and this time there would be nowhere left to run." The pieces were falling into place now. Elena's constant vigilance, her fear of storms, the way she sometimes stared toward town with the look of a trapped animal. She wasn't his housekeeper by choice. She was a refugee, and his ranch had become her final sanctuary. "Elena," Jake said, his voice carrying a promise that made her look up at him with something like hope. "Nobody's taking you anywhere, not while you're under my roof. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Jake's voice was iron. "And tomorrow we're going to make sure El Lobo understands too." Jake Mitchell didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch with a rifle across his knees, watching the desert shadows shift under a silver moon, waiting for trouble he knew was coming. Elena had retreated to her cabin after their conversation, but he'd seen the lamp burning in her window until well past midnight. Fear had a way of keeping folks awake, and they both knew that speaking Diego's name aloud had changed something fundamental. The next morning arrived with an ominous stillness. No wind stirred the dust, no birds sang from the mesquite trees, and even the cattle seemed subdued, huddled together as if sensing danger on the horizon. Jake was checking his weapons when Elena appeared at the kitchen door, her face pale as bleached bone. "Senor Mitchell," she whispered, pointing toward the main road. "Riders coming." Jake squinted against the morning glare and counted 3 silhouettes approaching at an unhurried pace. They rode like men who owned the world and everyone in it, backs straight, heads high, radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. "Get inside," Jake ordered. "Lock the doors. Don't come out no matter what you hear." Elena nodded and disappeared into the house. Jake heard the bolt slide home, then the scrape of furniture being moved against the door. Smart woman. The riders drew closer, and Jake could make out their leader, a man with silver-streaked hair and the lean build of a desert predator. He wore expensive clothes that looked out of place in the territory, a tailored black jacket, polished boots, and a hat that probably cost more than most men made in a month. This had to be Diego Castellanos. The 3 men stopped their horses 20 feet from Jake's porch, close enough for conversation but far enough to avoid a quick draw. Diego's companions were cut from rougher cloth, hired guns with cold eyes, and hands that rested too casually near their weapons. "Buenos dias, Senor Mitchell," Diego called out, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Beautiful morning, no? Perfect for neighborly visits." Jake didn't move from his position by the porch rail, rifle held loose but ready. "You're not my neighbor, Castellanos, and this isn't a social call." Diego laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Ah, you know me. How flattering. Yes, I am Diego Castellanos, and I believe you have something that belongs to me. I don't have anything of yours. Come now, amigo." A small woman, dark hair, pretty eyes. "She's been playing house with you for 3 months. Time for the game to end." Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. "Elena works for me, that's all." "Elena?" Diego's eyebrows rose with mock surprise. "Is that what she calls herself now? How creative. The woman I know goes by many names, depending on her current employment. But her debts remain the same, regardless of what she whispers in your ear." One of Diego's men, a scarred brute with arms like tree trunks, shifted in his saddle. "Want us to go get her, Jefe?" "Patience, Ramirez," Diego murmured, his eyes never leaving Jake. "Senor Mitchell and I are having a civilized discussion." He leaned forward in his saddle. "You see, my friend, the woman in your house owes me a considerable sum. Her late husband, God rest his soul, borrowed heavily to pay for medicine during his final illness. When he died, the debt passed to his widow. Simple mathematics. Funny how these debts always seem to involve women ending up in saloons," Jake said. Diego's smile turned sharp as a knife blade. "A woman must pay her debts however she can. I am not an unreasonable man. I provide employment opportunities for those in difficult circumstances. Get off my land." The temperature seemed to drop despite the climbing sun. Diego's 2 companions tensed, hands moving closer to their guns. But Diego himself remained relaxed, almost amused. "Senor Mitchell, I respect your attachment to the woman. Perhaps we can reach an arrangement. I am prepared to offer you compensation for the inconvenience of losing your housekeeper. Say, $50? Not for sale. 100 then. Very generous for a used woman." Jake brought the rifle up in one smooth motion, the barrel aimed directly at Diego's chest. "Last warning, ride away." Diego's companions drew their weapons, but their leader held up a hand to stop them. Now, gentlemen, no need for violence. Yet." He looked at Jake with something like respect. "You have courage, rancher. Foolish courage, but courage nonetheless. More than you'll ever have, hiding behind hired guns. These men are insurance. I learned long ago that in this territory, a man must be prepared for all possibilities." Diego gathered his reins. "I will give you 1 day to reconsider, Senor Mitchell. 1 day to deliver what belongs to me. After that—" He shrugged elegantly. "Well, accidents happen on these lonely ranches. Fires start, cattle stampede, good men disappear into the desert." The 3 riders wheeled their horses around and headed back toward town, moving with the same unhurried confidence they'd arrived with. But Jake noticed that one of them, the scarred one called Ramirez, kept looking back over his shoulder. As soon as they were out of sight, Elena emerged from the house, her face etched with terror. "You see," she said, her voice breaking, "I told you, he will not stop. He will bring more men, more guns. You should let me go with him before—" "Nobody's going anywhere," Jake cut her off. "But you're right about one thing. He'll be back with more men." Jake looked toward town, his mind already working. "Which means we need more men, too. Who will help us? You heard him. He owns the sheriff, the judge. Who in Copper Ridge would stand against El Lobo?" Jake shouldered his rifle and headed for the barn. "I know a man who doesn't care what El Lobo owns. Question is whether he's still alive and willing to settle an old debt." Jake saddled his fastest horse, while Elena paced the kitchen like a caged wildcat. He'd told her about Sam Torres, the former Texas Ranger who'd settled in the hills east of Copper Ridge after taking a bullet that ended his career, but not his sense of justice. Sam owed Jake a debt from 2 winters back when Jake had pulled him half-frozen from a blizzard and nursed him through pneumonia. "You sure he'll help?" Elena asked for the 3rd time as Jake checked his rifle and pistol. Sam Torres never forgot a favor or forgave a wrong. If he's still breathing, he'll come. Jake swung into the saddle. Lock yourself in the root cellar if anyone comes before I get back. Don't come out for nobody except me or Sam. The ride to Sam's cabin took 3 hours through rough country that discouraged casual visitors. Jake found the old ranger sitting on his porch, cleaning a shotgun with the methodical precision of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. Sam was past 60 now, his hair white as desert sand and his left leg stiff from old wounds, but his eyes were still sharp as a hawk's. "Jake Mitchell," Sam said without looking up. "Figured you'd show up eventually. Heard there's been talk in town about El Lobo and a certain rancher who's forgotten his place. News travels fast. Bad news travels faster than lightning in these parts." Sam set down the shotgun and studied Jake's face. "You're fixing to do something stupid, aren't you?" Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. "Diego Castellanos has been terrorizing a woman who works for me, claims she owes him money." "And you believe her?" "I believe the bruises on her wrists." Sam nodded slowly. "El Lobo's got a reputation for collecting debts in interesting ways. What do you need?" "Help settling this permanent-like." Sam was quiet for a long moment, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. "I'm too old for this kind of foolishness, Jake, and too smart. But you'll do it anyway." A ghost of a smile crossed Sam's weathered face. "Reckon I will. Man can't let evil flourish just because he's got creaky joints." He stood up, favoring his bad leg. "What's the plan?" "Diego's got a compound near Red Mesa. Word is, he keeps stolen goods there. Runs his operation from a fortified ranch house. If we hit him there, instead of waiting for him to come back to my place, we take the fight to him." Sam nodded approvingly. "Smart. El Lobo's used to being the hunter. Time he learned what it feels like to be prey." They rode hard through the afternoon heat, following game trails and cattle paths that would keep them off the main roads. As they neared Red Mesa, Sam held up a hand and they dismounted, leaving their horses tied in a grove of cottonwoods near a dried creek bed. "There," Sam whispered, pointing toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. Diego's compound was larger than Jake had expected. A main house built like a fortress, surrounded by barns, corrals, and bunkhouses. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Jake could see men moving between the buildings. Too many men. "Must be 20 of them," Jake muttered. "Closer to 30, Sam corrected. But most are probably just cowboys and drifters. The real hard cases will be staying close to the house." He studied the layout through a pair of field glasses. "What's that smaller building behind the barn?" Jake squinted against the glare. The building Sam had spotted was set apart from the others, with barred windows and only one door. "Looks like a jail. Or a prison." Sam's voice went cold. "Jake, I think your Elena might not be the only woman El Lobo's been collecting debts from." They crept closer, using the barn as cover. As they approached the isolated building, Jake heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of a child crying. Not the ordinary tears of a youngster with a scraped knee, but the desperate sobbing of someone who'd lost all hope. "Jesus," Sam whispered. "There's kids in there." Jake felt rage building in his chest like a head of steam. Through a gap in the boards, he could see inside the makeshift prison. 3 women huddled in one corner, and in another, a girl who couldn't be more than 8 years old sat chained to the wall. "We can't wait," Jake said. "We have to get them out now." Sam checked his weapons. 30 men, Jake. Even if we had the element of surprise. Then we make our own surprise. Jake looked around the compound, his mind racing. "See that hay wagon near the barn? And those coal oil lanterns hanging from the posts?" Sam's eyes lit with understanding. Fire. Create chaos, confusion, in the smoke and panic. We get the prisoners out and disappear into the desert. Jake gripped his rifle tight. "You still game, old man?" Sam Torres grinned, and for a moment he looked 20 years younger. "Son, I've been waiting 40 years for a fight this righteous." He checked his pocket watch. "Sun'll be setting in an hour. That's when we move." As darkness fell over Red Mesa, Jake and Sam crept toward their positions. Jake carried a torch made from an oil-soaked rag wrapped around a stick, while Sam positioned himself with a clear shot at the guards near the prison building. The compound was settling into its evening routine. Men heading to the bunkhouse, guards taking their posts, lanterns being lit against the gathering dusk. El Lobo's empire felt secure, protected, untouchable. In 5 minutes, Jake thought grimly, they were about to learn how wrong they were. He lit his torch and sprinted toward the hay wagon. The fire spread faster than Jake had expected. Within minutes, the hay wagon was a roaring inferno that caught the barn's dry timbers and sent flames climbing toward the star-filled sky. Shouts erupted across the compound as men ran from every direction, some carrying buckets, others just running. In the chaos, Sam's rifle cracked twice, dropping the guards by the prison building. Jake kicked in the door and found himself face to face with 4 pairs of terrified eyes, 3 women and the little girl he'd seen through the gap in the boards. "I'm here to help," Jake said quickly in Spanish, then English. "We're getting you out." The oldest woman, maybe 40 with graying hair, shook her head frantically. "It's a trap. El Lobo, he tests us sometimes. Sends men to see if we'll try to escape." "Look at me," Jake said firmly. "I'm Jake Mitchell. That's Sam Torres covering our exit. We're not El Lobo's men, and this isn't a test. Move now or burn with the rest of this place." The sound of his name seemed to convince them. The woman grabbed the little girl's hand and hurried toward the door. As they stepped outside, Jake saw Sam methodically working his way through Diego's men, his rifle speaking with deadly precision. But more guards were coming, and Jake could see muzzle flashes from the main house. "The creek bed," Sam shouted over the crackling flames. "Go, go, go!" They ran through the smoke and confusion, Jake herding the rescued prisoners while Sam covered their retreat. Behind them, the compound burned like a vision of hell, orange flames painting the desert rocks in flickering light. They'd made it halfway to the horses when Jake heard the sound he'd been dreading, hoofbeats coming fast. Diego had rallied some of his men and was giving chase. "Sam, we got company." The old ranger turned and dropped to one knee, his rifle finding targets in the darkness. "Take them and ride. I'll hold them off. Like hell, we all go or nobody goes." But even as Jake spoke, he could see they were outnumbered. At least a dozen riders were thundering toward them, with more streaming out of the burning compound. They'd rescued the prisoners, but they might all die in the desert for their trouble. Then salvation came from an unexpected direction. A new group of riders appeared on the horizon, not from the compound, but from the north. At first Jake thought it was more of Diego's men, but then he heard a familiar voice shouting orders. Sheriff Hayes and 6 deputies, riding hard toward the sound of gunfire. "What the hell," Sam muttered, still firing at the pursuing riders. Jake didn't have time to wonder why the corrupt sheriff had suddenly grown a conscience. He helped the women and child onto horses while Sam kept Diego's men at bay. By the time Hayes and his men arrived, the chase had turned into a running gun battle across the desert floor. It was over in minutes. Caught between Sam's precision shooting and the deputies' superior numbers, Diego's men scattered like quail, disappearing into the rocky canyons that honeycombed the area. Diego himself was nowhere to be seen, probably still back at his burning compound, watching his empire turn to ash. Sheriff Hayes rode up to Jake, his face grim in the firelight. "Mitchell, what in God's name have you done?" "Cleaned out a nest of vipers," Jake replied. "Question is, what are you doing here? Thought El Lobo owned you." Hayes dismounted, his hand resting on his gun butt. For a moment Jake thought the sheriff might arrest them all. Then Hayes sighed and pushed his hat back. "Diego made a mistake," Hayes said quietly. "He took Judge Morrison's niece 3 days ago. Said she owed gambling debts. Morrison sent word to the territorial governor, and suddenly I had federal marshals breathing down my neck, asking pointed questions about missing women." Jake looked at the rescued prisoners, understanding dawning. "Morrison's niece, is she—" "Right here," said the gray-haired woman who'd been so frightened in the prison. "I'm Catherine Morrison, and I owe you my life." The ride back to Jake's ranch took most of the night. The rescued women rode double with the deputies, while little Maria, the child they'd saved, clung to Jake's saddle like a scared kitten. She spoke only Spanish and seemed to trust no one except Jake, perhaps because he'd been the first face she'd seen when the prison door opened. Dawn was breaking over the desert when they finally reached Jake's land. Elena ran from the house as soon as she saw them coming, her face a mixture of relief and amazement. "Dios mío," she whispered, taking in the group of rescued women. "You actually did it." "It's not over," Jake warned. "Diego's still alive, and he's going to be madder than a stepped-on rattlesnake. He'll come for us, and he'll bring an army." Sheriff Hayes nodded grimly. "Morrison's already wired for federal help, but it'll take days for marshals to get here. Until then—" He looked around the ranch with professional eyes. "This place is defensible, but you'll need more men." "I'll send word to every rancher in the territory," Sam said. "Most of them have lost cattle or men to El Lobo over the years. Time to settle accounts." As the sun climbed higher, Jake looked at his ranch. No longer a quiet sanctuary, but a fortress preparing for war. Elena stood beside him, little Maria clinging to her skirts, while the other rescued women helped prepare defenses. Diego Castellanos had built his power on fear and intimidation. Now Jake Mitchell was about to show him what happened when a good man stopped being afraid. The war for Copper Ridge was just beginning. 3 days after the Red Mesa raid, Diego Castellanos came for blood. Jake spotted the dust cloud first, a brown smudge on the horizon that grew larger by the hour, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew their enemy had nowhere left to run. The ranch had transformed into an armed camp. Sam Torres had made good on his promise, and word had spread through the territory like wildfire. Ranchers who'd lost cattle to El Lobo's rustling operations arrived with their best men and plenty of ammunition. The widow Patterson brought her 4 sons, all crack shots who'd learned to handle rifles before they could properly walk. Even Father Miguel had ridden out from town, claiming he needed to minister to the wounded, though the Henry rifle across his saddle suggested he planned to create some wounded of his own. Jake stood on his porch, counting the approaching riders, 30 men, maybe more, all armed and riding like they owned the world. Diego had recruited every gun for hire between Copper Ridge and the Mexican border. "They're not coming to talk," Sam observed, checking his rifle for the 12th time. Elena emerged from the house, where she'd been helping the other women reload ammunition. Little Maria clung to her skirts, the child having barely left Elena's side since the rescue. The other women, Catherine Morrison and the 2 others they'd freed from Diego's prison, had proven surprisingly handy with weapons themselves. "He's out there," Elena said quietly, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "I can feel him watching." Jake nodded. Diego would want to see his enemy's face when the end came. The man's pride demanded nothing less than a personal victory over the rancher who dared to challenge his authority. The attacking force stopped just beyond rifle range, their leader clearly visible at the front. Even at a distance, Jake could recognize Diego's distinctive silhouette, the expensive black hat, the silver-trimmed saddle, the way he sat his horse like a conquistador surveying new territory to claim. "Jake Mitchell," Diego's voice carried across the desert air, amplified by the strange acoustics of the basin where the ranch sat. "I've come to collect what you stole from me." Jake stepped to the edge of his porch. "You want to fight, Castellanos? Come and take it." Diego's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. "Such brave words from a dead man. But I am not unreasonable. Send out the women and the child, and I might let some of you live." "Go to hell," Sam shouted back. "Hell is what you'll get." Diego raised his arm, and Jake saw sunlight glint off metal as the signal was given. The attack came from 3 directions. Diego's main force charged straight up the middle, while 2 smaller groups tried to flank the ranch from the north and south. Jake had expected this. It was a classic cavalry tactic, designed to split the defenders' fire. But Jake hadn't learned military strategy from books. He'd learned it from 5 years of fighting Apaches who could disappear into rocks and reappear like ghosts. He'd positioned his men accordingly. The widow Patterson's boys opened fire from the barn loft, their rifles cutting down the northern flanking party before they could close half the distance. Father Miguel and 3 ranchers held the southern approach, using the corral fence as cover while they methodically picked off Diego's men. The main assault stalled in the open ground before the house, caught in crossfire from defenders positioned in windows, behind water troughs, and on the roof. Jake had turned his ranch into a killing ground, and Diego's hired guns were paying the price. But Diego himself pressed forward, riding through the chaos with the fearlessness of a man who'd never lost a fight. Jake saw him coming and stepped down from the porch, rifle in hand. "This ends now, Castellanos." Diego dismounted 50 yards away, his ornate pistols gleaming in the afternoon sun. "See, it ends now. Just you and me, rancher, man to man." The gunfight lasted maybe 10 seconds. Diego was fast, faster than Jake had expected. But speed meant nothing without accuracy. Diego's first shot went wide, throwing dust at Jake's feet. His second shot was closer, burning a groove across Jake's shoulder. Jake didn't miss. His bullet took Diego's center mass, spinning the man around and dropping him into the dirt. Diego tried to raise his gun for one final shot, but Jake was already walking forward, rifle ready. "For Elena," Jake said quietly. "For Maria. For every woman you hurt." The second shot ended Diego Castellanos forever. With their leader dead, the remaining attackers broke and ran. Some of Diego's men had been true believers, but most were just hired guns who lost interest once the pay stopped. They scattered into the desert like tumbleweeds, seeking easier prey elsewhere. Sheriff Hayes arrived an hour later with a federal marshal and a full company of cavalry. The war for Copper Ridge was over, but Jake Mitchell had already won it. As the sun set over the Arizona Territory, Jake sat on his porch with Elena beside him and little Maria sleeping in Elena's lap. The ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of isolation, but the peace that came after justice had been served. El Lobo was dead, and the desert was safe again. 2 months after Diego's death, the Arizona Territory felt like a different place. News of El Lobo's defeat had spread from ranch to ranch, carried by cowboys and traders who spoke of it in hushed, almost reverent tones. The reign of terror that had gripped 3 counties was finally over, but for Jake Mitchell and the women he'd saved, the real work was just beginning. Elena had moved into the main house at Jake's insistence, taking over the large bedroom that had sat empty since he'd built the place. Little Maria slept in a small bed nearby, the child having formed an unbreakable bond with the woman who'd become her protector. The nightmares still came sometimes. Both Elena and Maria would wake crying from dreams of locked rooms and men with cruel hands, but they were growing less frequent. Jake had converted one of the unused rooms into a kind of sanctuary where the other rescued women could stay while they decided what came next. Catherine Morrison had returned to her uncle's house in town, but she visited the ranch frequently, bringing supplies and news from Copper Ridge. The other 2 women, Rosa and Carmen, had chosen to remain at the ranch, finding peace in the honest work of cooking, cleaning, and helping tend the growing household. It was Carmen who first noticed the change in Maria. The little girl had begun speaking more, mixing Spanish and English as she followed Elena around the ranch. But more importantly, she'd started asking questions about her past, questions that had no easy answers. "¿Dónde está mi mamá?" Maria asked one morning as Elena braided her dark hair. "Where is my mama?" Elena's hands stilled for a moment. In the 2 months since the rescue, Maria had never mentioned family, parents, or life before Diego's prison. The doctors in town said it wasn't unusual. Children who'd suffered severe trauma often blocked out memories as a way of protecting themselves. I don't know, Pequeña, Elena said gently. Do you remember her? Maria nodded solemnly. She had yellow hair, like the sun, and she sang songs about angels. The little girl paused, struggling with the memory. But the bad men took her away. They said she owed money, too. Jake had been standing in the doorway, listening. Now he stepped forward and knelt beside Maria's chair. What was your mama's name, sweetheart? Anna, Maria whispered. Anna Delgado. But the bad men called her other things. Elena and Jake exchanged a meaningful look. They'd been hoping Maria's family might still be alive somewhere, but Diego's operation had stretched across hundreds of miles. Finding one woman among all his victims seemed impossible. That afternoon, Jake rode into Copper Ridge to speak with Sheriff Hayes. The lawman had proven himself during the final battle, and Jake had developed a grudging respect for the man who'd found his courage when it mattered most. Anna Delgado, Hayes mused, flipping through a stack of missing person reports that had piled up during Diego's reign. Name sounds familiar. He pulled out a yellowed paper dated 6 months earlier. Here, filed by a priest in Tucson, said a woman named Anna Delgado disappeared from his mission, along with her daughter Maria. Jake felt his heart jump. The priest, he's still there? Far as I know, Father Rodriguez runs the San Xavier mission south of Tucson. Hayes handed Jake the report. Says here Anna was working in the mission kitchen, trying to save money to travel north. She and the girl vanished one night, along with 2 other women. 3 days later, Jake and Elena made the journey to Tucson, leaving Maria in Rosa's capable care. The San Xavier mission was a beautiful adobe structure, surrounded by gardens and fruit trees, a peaceful oasis in the harsh desert landscape. Father Rodriguez was a small, energetic man, with kind eyes and hands stained permanently brown from working in his garden. When Jake explained why they'd come, the priest's face lit up with hope and disbelief. Anna and little Maria, they are alive, gracias a Dios. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. I have prayed every day since they disappeared. Anna was such a good woman, so devoted to her daughter. What happened to them? Elena asked. The priest's expression darkened. Men came in the night. They said Anna owed them money, that her dead husband had borrowed from their patron. When Anna protested that she had no debts, they took her and Maria by force. He crossed himself. We tried to follow, but they had too many guns, too many men. Diego Castellanos, Jake said grimly. See, that was the name they spoke, El Lobo. Father Rodriguez gripped Jake's arm. But you said they are safe now? Maria is well? She's more than well, Elena said softly. She's loved. The priest studied Elena's face carefully. And you, Senora? You care for this child? Like she was my own daughter. Father Rodriguez nodded slowly. Anna would want that. Before she was taken, she made me promise something. She said if anything happened to her, I should find good people to care for Maria. People who would love her not for what she could give them, but for who she was. Jake felt Elena's hand find his. We'd like to adopt her legally, make sure she's protected. Nothing would make me happier, the priest said. But first, there is something you should know about Anna. He led them to a small chapel behind the main mission building. There, beneath a simple wooden cross, was a fresh grave, marked with a hand-carved headstone. She never made it to Diego's compound, Father Rodriguez explained quietly. The men who took her, they said she fought too hard, tried to escape too many times. They brought her body back here 3 weeks ago, said it was El Lobo's mercy that she could be buried in holy ground. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jake felt rage and sorrow war in his chest. Anna Delgado had died trying to save her daughter, never knowing that Maria would eventually find safety and love. Does Maria know? The priest asked. Jake shook his head. We'll tell her when she's ready, when she's old enough to understand that her mama died a hero. As they prepared to leave Tucson, Father Rodriguez pressed a small leather pouch into Elena's hands. Anna's belongings. She would want Maria to have them. Inside was a simple gold cross on a thin chain, a pressed flower, and a letter written in Spanish. Elena read it aloud as they rode back toward Copper Ridge. To whoever finds my daughter, please love her as I have loved her. She is the light of my world, and she deserves to grow up free and happy. Tell her that her mama fought for her until the very end, and that every prayer I ever said was for her safety and joy. By the time they reached the ranch, both Jake and Elena were crying, but they were tears of resolution, not just sorrow. Maria had lost her birth mother, but she'd gained something precious, a family built not on blood, but on choice, love, and the fierce determination to protect what mattered most. Spring had returned to the Arizona territory with unusual gentleness, as if the land itself was healing from the wounds Diego Castellanos had carved across it. The desert bloomed with wildflowers that painted the landscape in brilliant yellows and deep purples, and for the first time in years, travelers moved freely along the roads without fear of bandits or worse. Jake Mitchell stood on his porch, watching Maria chase butterflies through Elena's vegetable garden. The child had grown 3 inches in the past year, her dark hair now reaching past her shoulders, her laughter ringing clear and sweet across the ranch. She still wore her mother's gold cross around her neck, but the shadows that had once haunted her eyes were gone, replaced by the bright curiosity of a girl who knew she was safe and loved. Elena emerged from the kitchen, flour dusting her apron, and Jake felt the familiar warmth that had grown between them over the months of shared purpose and quiet understanding. They'd married in a simple ceremony at Father Miguel's church 6 months ago, with Maria as their flower girl and half of Copper Ridge in attendance. It hadn't been born from desperate romance or passionate declarations, but from something deeper, the recognition that 2 wounded souls could heal each other and create something beautiful in the process. The adoption papers came through, Elena said, holding up an official-looking envelope. It's final. She's legally ours now. Jake nodded, though they'd all known for months that the paperwork was just catching up to reality. Maria had been theirs from the moment they'd chosen to fight for her, just as they'd become hers when she'd decided to trust them with her broken heart. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts. A small group of riders crested the hill, Sheriff Hayes, Judge Morrison, and a man Jake didn't recognize wearing a federal marshal's badge. They dismounted near the porch, their expressions serious but not troubled. Jake, Elena, Hayes nodded respectfully. This is Marshal Garrett from Tucson. He's got news about the rest of Diego's operation. Marshal Garrett was a lean man, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's dark side. Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Mitchell, I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. Breaking up Castellanos' network saved more lives than you'll ever know. It wasn't just us, Jake replied. It took a lot of good people standing together. That's exactly why I'm here. Garrett pulled out a leather portfolio. We've been tracking down the rest of Diego's operations across 3 territories. Found record books, lists of victims, locations of other compounds. In the past year, we've rescued 43 women and children, shut down 12 illegal operations, and arrested over 100 men. Elena gripped Jake's arm. 43 women? And counting. Word spread about what happened here, how one ranch stood up to El Lobo and won. Other victims started coming forward, other communities found their courage. Garrett smiled grimly. Diego thought he was building an empire of fear. Instead, he created a network of evidence that destroyed everything he'd built. Judge Morrison stepped forward, his usually stern demeanor softened by something approaching warmth. Jake, the territorial governor wants to offer you the position of federal marshal for this district. The job comes with real authority, decent pay, and the backing of Washington. Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering. A year ago, he might have been tempted by the offer, the chance to continue the fight, to bring justice to other forgotten corners of the territory. But now he looked at Maria, still chasing butterflies with the single-minded determination of childhood, and at Elena, whose face had finally lost the last traces of fear. "I appreciate the offer, Judge, but I've got everything I need right here." Marshal Garrett nodded with understanding. "Figured you might say that, but the offer stands if you ever change your mind." After the officials left, Jake and Elena sat on the porch swing he'd built last winter, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Maria had tired of chasing butterflies and was now helping Rosa feed the chickens, her serious concentration making Jake smile. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen those bruises that morning?" Elena asked quietly. Jake considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I figure wondering about the past is like trying to rope the wind. What matters is what we do with today." Elena leaned against his shoulder. "Father Rodriguez wrote again. He says more families are coming to the mission, women and children who escaped from other places like Diego's compounds. They want to start over, build new lives. And I was thinking, maybe we could help. This ranch is big enough, and Maria could use some friends her own age." Jake smiled, understanding. Their own healing had taught them that sometimes the best way to honor your survival was to help others do the same. "Reckon we could always use more hands around here." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Maria ran up to the porch, her face flushed with excitement. "Papa Jake, Mama Elena, look what I found." She held up a perfect arrowhead, black obsidian that caught the last light of day. "Rosa says it's from the old people, the ones who lived here before anyone. She says they left it for me to find." Jake lifted Maria onto his lap, marveling at how natural the word "papa" sounded from her lips. "What do you think it means?" Maria considered this with the gravity of a child who'd learned that some questions were worth pondering. "I think it means this place is magic. It takes broken things and makes them whole again." Elena met Jake's eyes over Maria's head, and he saw his own thoughts reflected there. Out of violence and fear, they'd built something precious, not just a family, but a sanctuary, where healing was possible and love could grow in even the harshest soil. The desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of rain and new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, Jake Mitchell had everything a man could want. A wife who'd chosen courage over fear, a daughter who'd learned to trust again, and a piece of land where broken things could indeed be made whole. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, its voice wild and free. Jake smiled and held his family close, knowing that some stories end not with dramatic flourishes, but with the quiet satisfaction of promises kept and love freely given. The legend of the quiet rancher who'd made El Lobo disappear would be told around campfires for generations. But Jake Mitchell was content to let others tell those tales. He had more important work to do, the daily miracle of building a life worth living, one gentle day at a time.